Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Chris Heuer, and this is CXDNow, because the time for customer experience design is now. Of course, we're sponsored by IBM Commerce and the Journey Designer product, helping customer experience designers map customer journeys. Really exciting to be able to work with IBM broadly as a futurist in several of their programs, and have a chance for them to let me do what I like to do with my life and have that be supported without much direction on their part, actually. Although in our second segment today, we will be joined by Sarah, who's part of the Journey Designer team. She's going to share some of her thoughts on the future of CX. But first, we're going to start off talking with somebody I met through the wonderful Summit series. Actually, I haven't met in person yet. This is actually the first time. Well, no, we did video chat before. But a good friend of a best friend, Nicole Patrice, thank you again very much. And everyone else, and Kelly Hook for introducing us in the wide circle that is Summit. Heading off to Summit at Sea right now, this is Tobias Rose. Thank you for joining us, Tobias.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Awesome, awesome. So you are in Miami right now, and you're heading to do what this week or this weekend?
So I'm about to get on a boat with several hundred other people. We're going on this cruise called Summit at Sea, which is the second time that Summit Series has done this crazy collective kind of TED on a boat experience that includes a lot of thought leaders, a lot of entrepreneurs. It's a little bit like a Davos for Gen Y, is what they say, or a Davos for millennials, I guess, to some degree. So it's this crazy 3-day experience in which a lot of people come together to share ideas and watch incredible talks. Richard Branson was on the last time. This time it's Martha Stewart. Edward Snowden's going to be joining us by conference. Eric Schmidt, Travis from Uber, a bunch of crazy people will be on this cruise over the course of the next couple of days. So trying to get as much sleep as possible in advance of the experience.
That's awesome. I'm so jealous. I wish I could be there with you. I was trying, and I just couldn't make it happen with the startup and all the other community work. But
I really totally understand.
Really excited that that's going to happen, and looking forward to some report outs. And actually, that is a heck of a customer experience design that BizNow and the whole team put together there at Summit. So
for sure,
enjoy that week ahead. But I want to go backwards before we go forwards. So I had a chance to talk with Tobias already, so I've heard his story and I've read a little bit about him. Tobias, I'd like you to actually start with perhaps the origin story of where you first became aware of customer experience, and kind of the epiphany that you had, and really share your own story about how you came to look at this idea and what brought you into the work.
Sure. Yeah. I have a little bit of unconventional background as it relates to the kind of consulting that I do around customer experience and user experience design. I started out my professional life more or less working. I was in the wine industry, in the high-end wine industry for a little while in the Napa Valley, and ended up pretty soon after college diving into a really bizarre experience in Asia. I went traveling when I was about 24 years old, 23, 24, kind of in this off time between the harvest season in the Napa Valley, and ended up meeting a monk while I was traveling, who was looking for help in rebuilding this giant irrigation system that had been destroyed during the Civil War in Cambodia. So I was in Cambodia. I was wandering around the temples as a young guy, as a backpacker, and ended up meeting this monk who basically asked me to come out to his village. So had this very, very bizarre, unique, and unconventional experience, getting introduced to this community of about 6,000 people that basically had this huge reservoir that provided them with a second crop of rice annually. And it's kind of strange to think about this in the context of customer experience and customer design, but they basically became my customers for better or for worse. I basically helped this community over the course of several years rebuild this large-scale irrigation system and reservoir system, and ended up starting an organization around it. But yeah, it was a very, very, very large-scale project and an unexpected one. So,
well, what was it about? What was it about that experience, though, that kind of woke something up inside you? And what was it that got awoken?
Yeah, sure. So basically, this community was approached by this monk who brought this community, and this monk was ostensibly, I don't know, he's on the time, and I'm not a particularly religious person, but this guy was very getting me out to this legend of nowhere. He got me this little Yoda in this tiny little, town that was 3 hours outside of northwestern Cambodia, in this town called Siem Reap, where there's these giant temples known as Angkor Wat that are nearby. And he introduced me to this commune council and series of village elders who basically one by one kind of got up and said, "Thank you for coming. We've been waiting for you. We have this problem. Our reservoir and our irrigation system, it's been destroyed. And it was destroyed during the Civil War, and we need your help in rebuilding it." And it was a very, very compelling story, but also one that I was very skeptical of at the time. I don't know if you've ever been in a developing country, you hear a lot of stories, you hear a lot of people kind of talking about their needs, and you don't necessarily believe them right away. But I offered to at least talk through their project and their problem together with them. And this monk, he ran a local association of other monks that kind of constituted a small non-governmental organization, like a nonprofit. And he was trying to raise money and support in general, I think, from anyone at the time to rebuild this large-scale reservoir. And so I said, "You have the wrong guy. I'm not your guy for it, but I am willing to at least talk to people and be an advocate on your behalf." And so I ended up spending a few weeks there with them that time, just talking through their entire the scope of their project, what it meant for this community. Basically, Cambodia has this large-scale rice industry that is split between the dry season and the wet season. And in the wet season, they can get one crop of rice. In the dry season, they get no crops. In a place like Thailand, which is just next door, they get 3 crops of rice because there is proper irrigation systems management and control. So they have dams and canals and proper structure and stuff like that. So what this really became for me initially was trying to understand the needs of this community in a really coherent and clear way. And so there was a couple of things that play there. One was this kind of deep and abiding sense of empathy that I really, I think have, I do a lot of research on empathy right now. So this is this very, very common component of my work right now. But at the time, it was this sense of kind of injustice about this project that they'd estimated costing like $20,000 to affect roughly 6,000 people and give them their second crop of rice, which is huge. So yeah, so basically I started being an advocate on their behalf and started doing these interviews with the community, started talking to them about this thing at the end. There was this 1,000-year-old structure, this reservoir that they had that people built a long time ago as part of the old Angkorian irrigation systems. And I was kind of this temple notes. I mean, it was so idyllic, beautiful. You can actually go to humantranslation.org and see some of the photographs associated with it. But basically, we had this big problem, which was this community was missing this thing that provided them what was essentially a surplus. If they had it, a second crop of rice, they'd get surplus. They could go from subsistence to surplus. They could actually, and this is the people who live on less than $2 per day. So it's very, very poor group. So so I came back to the States pretty soon after that and started trying to translate that message to people in a way that I could generate support, both through engineering support as well as financial support for this project. I'm a designer by training. I just studied design and psychology in school. Art, design, and psychology. There's 3 things, and I ended up basically working at talking to as many people as I possibly could about this project because I found it so fascinating, and I really felt like I could be a fulcrum for connection. I had this real strong feeling that most people in America and most developing countries have a very strong and abiding sense of empathy and compassion, but they don't necessarily have a direct connection to causes that are in need and that have a real clear sense of action associated with it, like not a clear result. And I think there's this inverse correlation between complexity and action, right? So if you have less complexity, you have more capacity for actually people to do things and to act on a project. So I try to simplify as much as possible for people and reduce the issue to this very, very clear kind of cogent, approach with them. So I ended up with this kind of like, I guess you could say these two customer bases, which was this group of villagers in Cambodia that needed help, and a bunch of donors in America that were interested in helping. And it's kind of interesting to map the difference between philanthropy and business in this. But over the course of about a year, I raised, I want to say I raised about $30,000 for this project. It was initially scoped at $20,000, and maybe it was going to take about a year to do that. I ended up, just to fast forward, I ended up living in Cambodia for 5 years. Wow. And raising $250,000 to this project, and then onward raising about $1 million to this community through a bunch of different agencies, including the United Nations, over the course of that time. So ended up becoming a much larger entity than I expected initially, and we ended up scoping ourselves much larger in this community to help affect and solve a lot of the problems there. And a lot of our staff there are still doing great stuff, but I know I was jumping very far ahead, but
well, let's get to one thing relative to the result of this, because you did better than actually even just increasing to 2 crops, right? What was the net impact to that community?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So we expected this reservoir to be a natural boom for the community, and what it actually was an ecotourism, which is really surprising. We filled this thing just that we run just from work. We're part of borders. There was stuff of about 10 people over the course of 5 years. At one point in time, our staff actually was around 40 when we were doing construction on the Watergate structure itself. But we found landmines in the area. So Cambodia is one of the most heavily mined countries in the world, and we found a lot of landmines. We found dozens of anti-personnel landmines and several anti-tank mines on the site. And so that had to halt our entire endeavor for quite a while. And we ended up bringing in this Cambodian mine action team, which is a bunch of military people that know how to plant mines and also how to demine them. And we demined this whole area that we were working in, which is a very large area. When we say reservoir, we think of kind of a small thing, but it was about a mile to a side. So it was wow, pretty large. Yeah, it was pretty large. You can see it was a lake. It's basically a lake. And you can see on the site on humantranslation.org, you can take a look at a couple of pictures during construction and then after.
And what's the URL?
Yes,
so we can share that.
humantranslation.org.
Great.
That's the name of the organization that we ended up building around this project. So so basically, the outcome of this, we expected it to be this fairly this fairly straightforward agricultural project. And then when we filled this thing in with water, we ended up with just hundreds of people coming to the site on a regular basis to swim and fish and camp and hang out. And it ended up being this like regional hub for ecotourism, because we basically immediately we ended up with a bunch of like rare and endangered birds that flocked to the reservoir. So people would come to see the birds, they would come to swim, and now there's hundreds of little like food shops and recreational activities that go on around the reservoir every single weekend. So it was kind of a shock to understand that this thing, it's like, it really was, if you build it, they will come. Kind of that situation in an unexpected way. We didn't quite expect it to be anything more than an irrigation system. It ended up being much more powerful than that. So
it's interesting. We got to wrap this one to move in the next segment here, but I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna recount your story through the lens of CX and kind of a framework that points out some really important lessons, I think, inside of it that become more universal. And the first one is really relative to the empathy story. It's a constant theme here, is actually about having concern and compassion and caring for others. And I think the world as a whole is moving more towards that direction. That's actually what we're doing with another project that I've got related to this called We Are the Solution, although we'll talk about that separately. I think also what you really hit on here is that, it is a journey. And actually your journey really exemplifies that. I mean, you're going to run into landmines sometimes literally, which is a whole different sort of problem to run into, but you get them every day. It requires partners in order to be successful. So we've got to reach out and find the right people to do it with, whether that's inside of a company trying to figure out how to get a product to market, or if it's inside a community, as the case may be. It also requires human engagement and understanding what people want, what they need, and how they relate to things. And then ultimately, it's not about the destination you think you have in mind when you start of building the one dam. It's actually about getting past that point of completion, closure, sale, if you will, and thinking about the long-term value, enjoyment, and satisfaction that comes from its use. And I think it's just a really lovely story that epitomizes the way that we've been looking at CX and the sort of overall journey over time in a really lovely way, which is why I'm really glad you're able to make this time available for us and share this story with us. And your background on CX and design is even more interesting in some ways, although that story is so compelling. But I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this segment for now, and then we'll pause and we'll come back here and come back to a little bit more about the design and customer experience theory and strategy and tactics specifically. And I'm Chris Heuer, and this is CXDNow, Customer Experience Design Now. I'm here today with Tobias Rose. We just heard the story of humantranslation.org, project that he did in Cambodia to rebuild the reservoir and ultimately build an entirely new vibrant community around it. A really fascinating story that epitomizes some of the core principles of customer experience design and journey mapping in a very deep, meaningful way. Thank you very much for sharing, Tobias. I appreciate that very much. And thank you also. Oh, thank you. And thank you very much to IBM Commerce and the IBM Journey Designer team for supporting this show and enabling us to do conversations like this one with Tobias. We'll be back in just a moment.